Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Miami versus Florida game that happened in week one. Now, sorry for everybody. I've been on a brief, college football hiatus with the show and everything, but I'm back. I'm ready to talk college football, and I definitely have a lot to say about this game. Going into it, I was really anticipating a relatively competitive game. What's nice about this game was, Mario and Cristobal and Billy Napier are kind of in the same boat where, Mario is obviously trying to write his story where, he started off at Oregon. It was kind of shaky, rocky, wasn't really working out, and decides to go back to his alma mater at Miami. And they give him a bunch of NIL money. He really went hard, recruiting as well. And it definitely paid dividends where Miami decided to use the majority of their money for NIL. Florida kind of went a different route and decided to spend more money on a bigger, assistant pool and also to upgrade the facilities as well. And clearly, based on that first game, it's just totally two polarizing, you know, perspectives moving forward. Now, before I get into Florida, which is really probably the main purpose of this segment, I do want to give Miami a hell of a lot of credit. I would say, two of my biggest takeaways were obviously, I think Cam Ward is pretty freaking legit, dude. And everything he said about the crowd being not nearly as loud as what he's seen against USC and some of those bigger schools was 100% accurate. You saw those games as soon as Miami went up by three possessions, the crowd was just instantly not into it anymore. And people were even leaving the stadium while DJ Lagway was getting into the fourth quarter because of Mertz's concussion, which we'll get into a little bit. But, I saw somebody who is definitely a Heisman Trophy candidate this year, no matter what. I mean, he threw for about 350 yards, three touchdown passes, one interception. He just seemed like he was exactly the way he was in Incarnate Word in Washington State. He was dynamic. He moved out of the pocket. He was making the throws on the field. He was letting his playmakers be playmakers. And ultimately, when you have that sort of combination, coupled with Miami really shutting down everything that Florida even remotely tried to do, it's a recipe for success. And I quite frankly think Miami does deserve that kind of credit. And even going into the season, I'll be the first one to admit I thought Clemson was going to really bounce back and ultimately win the ACC. But when you have Florida State, who's off to a really crappy start, you have Clemson, who lost their game, North Carolina State, who struggled against Western Carolina, and Georgia Tech and Boston College, of course, won too. But when I look at this new ACC, all of a sudden, after 1 week, a lot of the momentum has really shifted towards Miami ultimately winning the ACC, and more than likely, also making a college football appearance too. I mean, they do have to still, the hardest games they have left on the schedule are really they do have to. I do believe they have to play Louisville and Florida State. I think they might have to play USC too, but I could be mixing up Florida State's schedule with Miami, so don't quote me on that. But nevertheless, the big takeaway from this game was obviously Cam Ward is a legitimate Heisman Trophy candidate. And also number two, Miami's defense looked really, really strong. Obviously, a lot of the criticism surrounding Miami in general were, Mario Cristobal kind of making boneheaded personnel and game management, clock management situations. Particularly, the best example is the now infamous fourth down where they could have just ran out the clock, but for whatever reason they decided to run a play against Georgia Tech, fumbled the ball, and ultimately lost the game while they were, I think, ranked somewhere in the top 20. I don't know exactly where they were ranked, but it was maybe a little bit after this year, but they were certainly ranked. But in any event, I think Miami definitely deserves a hell of a lot of credit. And going into these next couple weeks, it's going to be really fascinating to see to what extent will Miami kind of build on this momentum, especially when I just allude to it before. You have the North Carolina States, the Clemsons, Florida States, all those teams, really struggling at the moment. So I'm definitely excited to see where this kind of leads and takes us. But at the same time, you know, I think ultimately, Florida's performance, I think, is kind of overshadow Miami's. I think it's more just how terrible Florida came out, not so much that Miami doesn't deserve credit, but it's really just how lackluster Florida is. And, too, I'll be the first one to say, as a Florida fan, I got pretty pissed off watching that game because one of the first episodes I ever did of the show was talking about Florida, kind of the expectations going in. And, also briefly before I started this podcast, I did cover the Florida Gators for a handful of months before I decided to do my own thing. So I was really looking forward to this game, and especially too after watching the start of the Utah game last year. There was just so many similarities that I'm going to get into without with keeping it relatively rational. But I think first things first. You know, I'll get into Billy in a second, but in terms of overall how the team looked, there really were little to no positives. I'd say the three biggest positives were obviously, you know, I said this before. I think Montrell Johnson is such a huge weapon, and I think he doesn't really get enough credit in terms of how much they can implement and use him. Now, granted, he did have that big, 75-yard rush against Miami too, but granted, that was, I guess, semi in garbage time where people sort of knew that the game was over. But I even mentioned this before. I really want to see more of Montrell Johnson being involved in the offense, particularly now that we know that DJ is starting next week versus Samford because of Mertz being under concussion protocol. So I do anticipate Johnson getting more carries that way to kind of make it a little bit more manageable for Lagway to not have to make as many, complicated decisions, a lot of quick reads, and really get him comfortable too. But the next thing I'd like to add is, you know, I've seen a lot of back and forth in terms of other analysts and Reddit and all that good stuff. But I want to be the first one, also to kind of ride on this train that I'm defending Graham Mertz in the sense that I think the stat sheet really didn't explain it all in that game. I mean, obviously he went 11 for 20 with 91 yards and an interception, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. I would argue that a lot of those kind of plays were, you know, being broken down one by the lackluster offensive line. I mean, I just don't think, I think ultimately he is going to get a lot of the blame because you have this, top of the class quarterback here who, in essence, if Billy could be gone next year, he might just transfer to a different program if, DJ sees the writing on the wall and doesn't want to have to go through what could very well be a rebuild going into next season. But, the other really issue is I mentioned this, at the beginning too when I was previewing Florida, but one of the biggest issues that I saw was that they're going to have to rely on a lot of younger receivers to, get the job done and really be able to move the ball. But that just was not true. I mean, Eugene Wilson was really the only legitimate passing weapon that could even remotely somewhat get open. And, there's only so many times where you can go to him because Miami knows, hey, if we double cover this guy and everybody else is, pretty much covered, then, all of that any sort of optimism that Florida could have had going into that game was quickly gone when you realize that the offensive line was clearly overmatched. There was only so many different ways for Graham Mertz to go. And quite frankly, I found a lot of the play calling to be, high school level, just very amateurish. I didn't really see many attempts to really try to stretch the field or get the tight ends involved or, use Montrell Johnson as much as I think they need to, because ultimately what's going to happen is, when you have an offensive line that can't protect Mertz and you have to make all these quick reads. I mean, it's just a recipe for disaster. And I I think you know, as there are comparisons for, Graham Mertz being compared to when he was at Wisconsin with all the interceptions and turnovers and whatnot, I don't think it's quite fair to insinuate that one little game suggests that he doesn't have anymore, because I think that 2023 campaign was a lot stronger than people give him credit for, particularly for being a very wise, you know, not turning the ball over, making those good decisions, and also protecting the football, and really not, not getting any, not having too many fumbles, only about 4 interceptions last year. And, you know, it is fair to say that people are going to want DJ in right away. Do I think he should be the guy over Graham right now? No, but do I think we're going to see more playing time from DJ this year, even if Mertz wasn't to not have a concussion right now? Absolutely. So I think this coaching staff is going to have to find that middle ground, especially, if we do run into the obstacle of Napier being fired midseason too, which I guess is a good, kind of lead way into this, because, at the end of the day, I think part of the issue is that what Billy's trying to do is, more or less, getting the quarterbacks involved in every aspect of the game, and that's great and everything, but it's obvious that Lagway is more athletic than Graham Mertz is, which is fine, and it's absolutely necessary for that to get going. But I think what I saw from Napier this year, I think I think they should. I think Florida fans and even myself are very concerned going into this game. I mean, we did hire Ron Roberts away from Auburn, which was supposed to be a key improvement, but we a lot of the issues that we saw last year, were just simply not there. They got overmatched and overplayed and outclassed just about in every aspect of the game, between the poor discipline from the front seven, to a lot of false start penalties, to to obviously just a lot of lackluster play calling. And when you kind of middle that all together, it's just proving that ultimately it seems to me that Billy Napier is simply out of his element, and just simply does not have what it takes to be a legitimate SEC head coach, which ultimately is going to open up the door for possible replacements for him, which I'm not going to get into because I do believe that's premature. But anybody who follows the game pretty extensively, and does live in rural Florida, knows that they're the fans want him out of here, and they want Strickland out of here too, which I do think is fair, because in one regard, yes, the schedule is brutal and it is tough, but I mean, you have to think to yourself, if this was the result against Miami, how do you think Florida is going to look against Ole Miss and Georgia and Florida State and all these other teams who are about to come in? It just makes you think that the likelihood of them really turning this around probably is very slim at this point. I mean, obviously, I think before we completely push the panic button, let's see how they look against Samford, Mississippi State, and UCF, and then Texas A&M are their next couple games. So the good news is we do have a little bit of a cushion, where I think at the very least, Billy has to go. They have to go at least 3-1 for him to really ultimately finish out the season. I mean, I'm not. I've said this time and time again, but I've never been a huge fan of firings within the middle of the season, because I mean, in this day and age of college football, I mean, unless you're hiring someone from another, even if you're hiring from another school, like, you still kind of have to wait for them for the season to be over anyway. So unless you plan on hiring a coach that's either not in college football, that's not in college football at all, I mean, there's really no sort of, you're not really getting too much of an advantage in terms of bringing in that staff immediately. I mean, it's great to know, or to reach out to him saying, hey, this is our guy, and then he can kind of assemble a staff when that's going down. But I think ultimately what this game really tells is a lot of those expectations that Florida had, are really dwindling, and any hope that that Florida fans kind of had in general is pretty much gone. But I mean, like I said, if they can go 3-1 and ride that sort of wave, I mean, they can maybe finish with a respectable 5-7, 4-8, but you know if Florida just kind of gets spanked and looks uninspired in those big games, then, you know, did we think that they were to lose? Yes, but there's a difference between losing, getting your ass kicked and being uninspired out there versus legitimately showing up, being competitive, and only losing by maybe 3 points or 6 points or 10 points, whatever the margin is. But ultimately, the last words I'm going to say is although the expectations were there, and I do think we all were excited to see how Florida was going to be. I ultimately Miami was the better team out there, and Florida continuously had the same issues that we saw in that last 5 games of the season last year, which was a poor defense, undisciplined, and head scratching play calling.